The big quiet doesn't define who I am. The big quiet will always be a part of me and the man that I am. And regardless of what I'm doing or not doing, what doesn't change is me. And so much of who I am comes from the experiences in my life. And all of those life experiences, regardless of how long they last for, how long the success is for, they shape me. And that nobody takes away from me. And that goes towards whatever I do next.
Jesse, I'm so grateful you're here.
Thanks for having me, brother. I've been looking forward to this.
Really, really grateful. Thank you for your time. You started a major movement in meditation, the big quiet. It's come to its close, and we'll talk about that. But the heart of it was meditation. And I wanted to know if you could lead us in a very sort of short meditation that would help us sort of set into the conversation for clarity and purpose and direction. What do you think?
I love that idea.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay.
All right, great. So if you're comfortable doing so, go ahead and close your eyes. And as we settle into the practice, just take a moment to notice the sounds of the studio that we're in. You might hear the buzzing of the lights, sounds from off of set, maybe a little bit of a background noise from the street. Whatever those sounds are, just welcome them in, noticing them. They've been here this whole time, but we likely haven't stopped to actually bring attention to them. And as we settle into those sounds, into that subtle quiet, bring your attention to your chest. And just notice how your body breathes by itself. How your chest gently rises and falls. Noticing your heart space. Notice any emotions or sensations that you might be feeling in your heart. And whatever you might be feeling, just allow yourself to feel it. Just to be with it without resisting or judging. When we let ourselves feel whatever we're feeling, it's like opening up a window and letting in a fresh breeze of air. And now that we're in tune with the sounds around us, in tune with our body and our emotions, you can take a moment to slowly blink open your eyes. And we're reset. And we're ready to go.
Yes. Wow. I know meditation in my daily practice has wonders in my life, in clarity, in my nervous system. It's just everything, every day I couldn't go without it. And that wasn't a time in my life, where I was always doing meditation. It was always recent. And as I've gotten more and more into it, I want to be able to show my loved ones, my kids. And, but I find that the answer that I get often is, I can't meditate, or that one doesn't work for me. For people who want to get into it, and there are so many standing and walking, what would you recommend is how to explore meditation, and also how can I teach it?
Yeah. When it comes to exploring meditation, I like to start by really encouraging people to understand that there's a general misconception around meditation. And it's that to meditate means that we are not thinking. To meditate means that the mind is silent, that the body's relaxed, and that if we're doing that, we're meditating, we're being a good meditator. And if we're not, we're a bad meditator or we can't meditate. And this is a misconception. There's a very, very small percentage of people that can just close their eyes and silent their mind like that.
Mm.
You know, living in 2024, the amount of information that we process today is so great. You know, we have a different thought roughly every 6 seconds. So we have to be realistic when we come into practice and understand that to try to make ourselves not think is likely going to make us actually think more.
Mm.
A lot of science shows that there's as much benefit when we're practicing and thinking as when we're practicing and in that calmer, you know, more zened out state.
Mm.
So I really invite people to shift the mindset and understand that if the mind's wandering in practice, it doesn't mean that they're doing it wrong. It actually means that it's working. They're getting the benefit. The stress is being released.
Mm.
It's just about understanding that that's part of the process. The other thing that I encourage people to do are to try different techniques. I really love a technique of meditation called the One Giant Mind technique. And there's a free app that teaches people how to do it. There's also the technique that I teach. And it's not about quieting the mind. You know, it's not about trying to make the mind be still. It's about allowing for whatever comes up and to allow ourselves move through it. And we think a sound, a mantra that comes from the Sanskrit language. And when we think it allows the mind and body to settle into a more relaxed state, regardless of if we're thinking or not.
Mm.
So just reminding people that there are different ways to practice meditation as well. And when it comes to wanting to teach it, of course, there are the obvious ways like doing meditation teacher trainings. But if it's really just about getting people to buy in and be excited and want to practice because it's this thing that's so important to you, what I always recommend that people do is not push it on people. Meditation is one of these things where the more we push it on people, the more people push away from it.
Mm.
So I find that the best way to get people in our lives to become interested in meditation is to do it regularly ourselves and let people see the change that occurs in us, right? Become embodied in the benefit of the practice. And people will start to notice a change. People will naturally become interested when they're ready. And if we can, you know, almost attract people in to the practice instead of trying to promote it on people, there's a much more natural sort of energetic exchange that happens.
Mm. You know, as I think about my meditation practice, I watched it increase in terms of regularity through the day, which also means that maybe I'm going through more and more things, right? And those things for me are major life changes. I'm approaching in 2025. It'll be my divorce trial after a 5-year divorce battle with kids involved. I have my partner who will be delivering our baby, and I'll have a new baby and becoming a new father. I mean, these are real life changes all within a month or two are happening. And so I'm meditating more because I'm trying to find a way to be able to close versions of in my life and give them the proper honoring, and also being mindful and have inner peace about the new chapters that I'm starting. You know, for me, it made me think about how 4 years ago when I went on a transformation and I called it my dark night of my soul, where a version of me really died, totally died. But I didn't have a cemetery. I didn't bury it. I didn't have a ceremony, and I didn't have anyone over to make a Shiva call for my former version. But there it was, and I just kind of moved on through life. And I'm wondering, did I miss that opportunity? And so for you, wow, a 9-year journey on the Big Quiet, which was just so incredible, leading, you know, some of the largest meditations in some of the coolest places on the planet. But come this summer, you decided that that journey had reached its end. How do you know when to close something? When's it the right time? And let's focus on this first part about the closing chapters. How do I honor my divorce
Yeah. Well, thanks, man, for being open about what's real for you in your life right now. And I just got to say, I love that you're thinking about this stuff through the lens of cycles,
Mm.
because everything in life, like everything in nature, is built around a cycle. Something is born, creation occurs, that thing grows for a period of time, and
Mm.
eventually, at some point, the time frame is always different. It returns back to the start, and it's ready to be complete.
So good.
And when nature's cycle is complete, the next cycle is ready to be born.
Mm.
So I love that you're naturally seeing that there's something to that, because I think when we get outside of nature and we get into, busy life in society, there's a lot of shame around things closing. There's a lot of shame around cycles completing, especially when the timeline doesn't line up with what we thought it was going to look like.
Mm.
For something like a marriage, when we go into the marriage, there's a good chance that the two people getting married think they're going to be together for a lifetime. And if something changes and that timeline is shorter than planned, that can be really painful.
Yeah.
And with that, there can be a lot of shame, or there can be the sensation of failure. And why I really like your question is because I think it's so important for us to think, if it's a relationship, if it's, family dynamics, if it's friendships, if it's businesses, whatever it might be, there's a timeline, there's a cycle. And when it's ready to be complete, the more we're able to accept and embrace, and like you said, ritualize and celebrate
Mm.
the closing of the chapter, the more we are able to align with what nature naturally wants for us, which is for change to occur and for creation of something new to be born. So you asked, how do we become in touch with that? How do we get into that flow and that rhythm of the cycle of all things? And I've had two major career cycles like this in my life. I ran a record label for 9 years, from the age of 20 to 29.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ran the Big Quiet for 9 years, from the age of 30 to 39. And the first time I had that big transition of leaving this record label, this thing I started in my dorm room when I was a sophomore at NYU, and as it was really kind of picking up its growth, I felt like it was so clear that it was time to move on, which was so confusing. I had my practice of meditation as a tool that allowed me to not only hear that it was time, but to have the courage to act on it. So the first piece to this is, what are the tools and practices that we have in our lives that allow us to really hear and trust that deeper intuition? Because so much of understanding when it makes sense to make a change has to do with a deeper feeling. I believe that nature's intelligence speaks through us through a fine level of feeling. It's an intuitive feeling. It's something we get in the gut. And for some people, it might take years before it's clear that it's time to act on that thing. For me, I started to get the feelings 2 years or so before we closed the Big Quiet that it was probably coming. And it took me a year of putting the big quiet on a break and saying, let me just get a little breathing room here before, we make any decisions. Because it was so scary to look at it.
Right.
And then eventually reached a point going into this year where it became really clear that it was time. So I think, part of this is, how do we have the tools and the practices that allow us to get clear? Can we give ourselves the time and the patience without rushing into it, without feeling any shame or pressure, to let the feeling naturally emerge that we know it's time? And then once we know that it is time, once we are ready to act on that change, what can we do to celebrate, ceremonialize, and ritualize that closing? So I think it'd actually be really interesting and fun to think about and talk through ways you might do that as your divorce comes to a completion, because there's so much probably to grieve and to celebrate there.
Right.
And if it's helpful, I can share what I did for the Big Quiet as my way of closing that chapter and celebrating it, so I could really open into the next thing.
I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So for us, there was so much excitement and popularity around the growth of the Big Quiet. Like you mentioned, we were doing mass meditations at a scale that really no one else was doing. By our 5-year anniversary, we were touring with Oprah and filling arenas of people in silence. And it was the coolest thing. And I think because it was so unique and because it was of service to so many people, there was a lot of hype around it. So of course, so much of my identity was tied to doing this one thing. So when it became clear that it was time to say goodbye to it, I was really kind of stuck with, do I just let this quietly fizzle and just never really say anything and hope that people don't really ask?
Mhm.
Or do we really put it out
Right.
there? Do we really,
Right.
say to our community of, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, to say, we did this amazing thing together.
Right.
We were able to create this because of you and what we were able to, magically bring into existence through all of these times over, 9 years. And like we talked about, like you and I just talked about, in nature, there's a cycle to all things. And it's become very clear to us that the cycle of the big quiet is complete. So we want to honor that. And in doing so, we made a short film, 3-minute short film that celebrates the 9-year journey of the big quiet. And we shared that film, we screened that film, we blasted it out, we put it on our Instagrams and our social media feeds. And it was a way to tell the story and thank everyone that was involved. We also did a billboard at Times Square. New York City was where the big quiet was started. It was very much our home. So the billboard was a way to say, thanks, NYC, for getting quiet with us for all these years. We're signing off, we're saying goodbye. And the last thing I'll mention that was so powerful for me was I wrote a letter to the big quiet. This was just a me and the big quiet thing. I wrote a letter to the big quiet, referring to the big quiet as you, saying, you taught me this. I learned this from you. You did this for me. And in that letter, was able to really celebrate our 9 years, thank the big quiet for what it taught me, say goodbye, and say, you'll always be a part of me.
I love that, because for me, it sounds like you're not only honoring this identity, this creature that you made into something, but also honoring all of those that were on the journey with you.
Yes.
You don't steal it or rob it from them.
Right.
Who's like, what happened to the big quiet? And so they get to celebrate along with you.
You nailed it. And I hadn't considered how powerful what you just said would be. Because people would say to me, why not just, keep it on the side? Who knows? Maybe in a couple years, you'll want to bring it back. Just let it be.
Right.
And I considered that. But if I had taken that approach, what would have never happened would have been the closure that came that allowed hundreds and hundreds of people to reach out to us and to send messages and to write letters, sharing what the big quiet meant for them, getting photographs of babies, of couples that met through the big quiet events, to just hear about the impact. That was one of the most potent experiences of my life, to really be reminded of the impact of what this thing did in the world. And that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't, publicly celebrated the closure.
Yeah. And allows all of those people to continue the journey with you into whatever your next is too.
Yeah.
Because now they know that part has come to a close.
Right.
Yeah, that's so helpful. I think when I'm thinking about the divorce, there is a lot of things that, almost miracles, that have come out of my divorce proceeding, that in the beginning I was fighting. In the beginning I was, struggling against. But all of these things that happened had to happen exactly the way they had to happen. And so I think for me, one of the things I'd like to do is have a ceremony, for that version of myself that I put away, that I laid down and said, this is no longer going to be me. But instead of just starting and being like, okay, I'm back in the game, and like I change clothes, having this real moment, because I think that's how the stepping stone to opening a new chapter.
Oh, it's so spot on, Judd, because we're talking a lot about nature and nature cycles. When you do what you just said there, when you really ceremonialize and celebrate an ending, it honors nature's cycle. And I believe that it just creates even more energy that flows in to that next chapter or to that next cycle. I think by celebrating the closing of something, we just enhance and boost up the energy for the thing that we're now making space for. So I think that process gets really supported.
Yeah. And that sounds like that process is applied to our personal and professional lives, changes of jobs. I mean, what we're talking about are major life transitions. When one door closes, another opens. When the plant withers and dies, it fertilizes soil for something
That's
else to
right.
grow. When these new things grow, how do we celebrate properly the new start?
Well, I'll tell you that probably the single most meaningful experience or practice that I had over this process of saying goodbye to the big quiet that allowed me to really open up into the joy and excitement of what's next came from crying.
Hmm.
I had to learn how to allow myself to grieve what the big quiet was, what I thought it was going to be, the way
Mm.
that I was perceived. I could feel that changing. When the big quiet was, at its peak before we went on our break a couple years ago, there was so much inbound. There was so much interest for the big quiet for me. And when we took our break, I really watched that slow down, and it changed the way that I felt I was in the world, and it shifted these parts of my identity. And to a certain extent, I had to grieve that version of myself. And that was probably one of the hardest and most powerful things I've ever done, to say, I'm consciously making a choice for this moment to take a break from some of the recognition because it's aligned with what I know I'm ready to do next. But in doing so, saying goodbye to some of that, and in saying goodbye to some of that, missing what it felt like to be recognized and to be celebrated and to always be wanted. And it's really what I needed, because I needed the
Mm.
space to really get clear on the next thing. But to do that, I had some good cries about it, man.
Hmm.
Some big, deep ones.
Hmm.
And it was through some of that emotional purging and letting myself really feel the emotional change that on the other side of it, I was able to feel so solid, so locked in, so clear that the big quiet doesn't define who I am. The big quiet will always be a part of me and the man that I am. And regardless of what I'm doing or not doing, what doesn't change is me. And so much of who I am comes from the experiences in my life. And all of those life experiences, regardless of how long they last for, how long the success is for, they shape me. And that nobody takes away from me. And that goes towards whatever I do next. So I was able to take all of the energy and learning of that chapter of my life and be like, all right, now it's time to go bring it to the next thing
Hmm.
and to celebrate the next thing and feel excited about the next thing. So,
Hmm.
yeah, being with emotions, feeling emotions, releasing the emotions that emerge and change, I think have so much to do with how we open up into what's next. And then not being afraid to be public about this stuff, to speak about this stuff. It's so easy to feel shame around closing or for chapters ending and to not want to talk about it. And what I found was that by acknowledging it, it put it out to the universe that there's change happening and that there's new things opening. And it's created more energy, more excitement for what's next.
Mm. It sounds like there are people, and I imagine this to be an incredibly lonely place, that have built an identity attached to something,
Big
and they
time.
just cannot close it, even though it doesn't have the same aura, the vibe, the energy. And they're holding on to it out of either this incredible fear of letting it die or what's the next.
Yes.
What do you say to these people who are really deeply stuck in this unwillingness to release this identity when they just know it's no longer the thing?
And it's so common what you've just described.
Mm.
And I think for a lot of people, they'll go most of their lives, in that grip.
Mm.
And we do see this a lot in relationships and in careers. And not everybody has the means to be able to, always take the leap.
Right.
So I think it's always important to, make room for that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think there are two key pieces to it. One is understanding that everybody's timeline for getting clear about when it's time to take the leap is different. And that I think for so many of us, we need to go through extended periods of it being out of alignment for us to realize that it's time to actually make the change. Sometimes we just have to really feel how unaligned something is to get to that place. And what I see is that when a cycle in nature is ready to be completed and we're not allowing for the completion to occur and we're holding on like you've described, nature will start to force the change.
Right.
And this is when gnarly, uncomfortable stuff starts to occur.
Right.
And sometimes we need those forces to get us to act on it.
You're working against the universe. You just keep getting whacked.
Exactly. And the harder people hold on, the harder the whacks. I noticed that in my first career transition, there were a lot more whacks. In the second career transition, 10 years later, I was able to more naturally trust in nature's process and I think align more with the flow of it. So less pain, less whacking. So I think part of it is just us understanding that. And I think the other piece is when people are really holding on tight, I like to ask them about what their relationship is to trust and faith, you know, and believing in a greater power or a greater energy that supports them. And there's a lot of good that happens. You know, there's a lot that gets unpacked in that conversation, because if somebody has lost connection with or relationship to their ability to trust in something greater, you know, to trust in the natural unfolding of their life, if that trust is lost, the grip and the holding on gets really tight.
Absolutely.
But if we can talk about ways that they can reestablish that deeper sense of trust and build more of that faith or knowingness within themselves, then the grip starts to loosen. And I find that different people have different practices or people or whatever it might be that allows them to come back into a place of trust.
How do you how would one anchor into the belief that like where they're heading is the right thing? You know, they say purpose and passion and gut, and what, like for you, where do you dial that sense in? And you know, some parts I would imagine for me, it's the meditation, it's the getting, just allowing space to have the clarity of what is next.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I find pretty consistently, and this is more so through my work mentoring people and coaching leaders, is that for most of us, the data is there if we look back on our lives. So a lot of times I'll say, think about a moment in your life where you felt similarly, right? Where the grip was really tight. You kind of lost your ability to trust that things were going to work out. What was that moment in your life previously where that happened? And what happened once you let go? You know, what happened, you know, once you allowed yourself to open up to trust again? And pretty consistently, people are able to say, you know, every time I've been in a situation like this and I've surrendered, it's worked out. Consistently, people will say it. And even the times where they let go and it led to something painful, it worked out. So much of this people inherently know, if we can get them to look back on their history and see how history has repeated itself for them when it comes to this time and time again. And sometimes all we need to do is be reminded of how it's been proven to us that it exists in our lives to allow us to start to open up. Now, if you want to supercharge that, throw in a practice like meditation. You know, for me, like I mentioned, that gave me the clarity and the courage to act on it.
When somebody is closing their chapter, something, whether it be a major life transition or a work transition, there's also times where that little sprout doesn't come up right away.
Yeah.
And I have felt like, uh-oh, where's the growth? Where's this next thing? The sun has risen and I don't see anything coming from the ground. How do you find the patience in allowing that? In other words, I think that a lot of people would feel that just as that nature cycle happens, that just because something closes, something immediately opens.
Yes.
And sometimes you can close something without having your next game.
It's very common, you know, to run with this thinking around the sprout, the seed sprouting and turning into a flower. Yeah, the human desire is we want that thing to grow fast, instantly. And again, not always the case. Timeline's always different, just like it is in nature.
Totally.
And I think the best way to run with that metaphor is to understand that it's not just about the growth of the seedling. It's not just about the flower. It's also about the soil. So when we're in transitions, it's so important that our focal point isn't placed on the flower, it's placed on the soil. What can we do to cultivate the healthiest possible soil? And really farm that soil and prepare that soil for harvest. So what that's looked like for me and a lot of people that I've worked with, it means just really doubling down on how we take care of ourselves, how we nurture ourselves, how we cultivate joy in the face of the unknown, and understand that by doing what we can to really focus on us and make that soil nutrient dense and rich, that with time, the seedlings will start to sprout. But that also goes back to trust. That also goes back to understanding that things aren't always in our control. The timelines aren't always in our control. When I left my record label, I was convinced that within 3 months, I'd have a concept for a tech startup that I'd raise a lot of money for and that I'd go bring to the world. And a year later, I was pretty much out of my savings, freaked out. And all I had was this deep passion for meditation and started organizing group meditations. And never in a million years did I think that organizing group meditations in my buddy's apartment for 15 people in this, period of transition when, the soil wasn't showing any flowers would lead to the big quiet and, become the most big, beautiful, bright, delicious smelling flower. And it was interesting because it took over a year before that flower started to sprout. But once it sprouted, after a year of what felt like nothing, this flower took off.
Strong plant. That's a great call. I love the perspective of rather than taking a box, flipping it, sitting down and just watching and waiting for something to grow, that start already is taking place. It's what are you doing to plowing the fields to getting ready for the next big quiet.
Make the soil great. It's it.
I can't thank you enough, Jesse, for coming on. I really appreciate it. As I think as my divorce comes closer, I'm going to write that letter. And I think that's a great takeaway. And also take the time to celebrate new beginnings.
And one thing I'll add to that I think could be valuable is bringing in some of the key people from the experience that you can reflect with, mourn with, celebrate with, share the letter with. Just having other people bear witness to that experience is the other key piece that I think will really allow for a beautiful close and a meaningful opening. So thinking about who those people are and considering asking them if they'd be open to having a ceremony with you where you're able to, reflect and celebrate in this way.
It's incredible.